The gravel crunched under her boots as she stepped onto the test site, early as always. Dawn hadn't finished unrolling itself across the sky yet, and already the air stank of diesel, sweat, and barely masked contempt. She clutched the printed report tighter to her chest. 62 pages of calculations, fatigue modeling, weld fatigue propagation under torsional stress, her weekend, gone in spreadsheets and coffee. She had double-checked every column, every margin, run the model with 2 redundant parameters just to be sure. It wasn't just numbers. It was her neck. And yet, her boots halted at the edge of the pit. The frame lay there like a half-buried rib cage, cables snaking out of it like guts, coated in yesterday's rain. The foreman, Rick, was already there, arms crossed, reflective vest open like he thought he was in a calendar shoot for Blue Collar Narcissists Monthly. She raised the report like a peace offering. He took one look at the cover sheet, ripped it from her hands, and without a word, let it fall, through it, into the cold, slick mud. She didn't flinch. The slap of wet paper hitting earth landed louder than his sneering voice. You ain't a welder. You don't drive steel. You're a meddling desk jockey pretending you know what strain looks like in real life. A laugh, a low, smug thing, slithered up from his throat. A couple of guys standing behind him snorted. One turned his back, but not before she caught the twitch of a smirk. That's all it took. Just a second too long of silence. Just enough to confirm. The report was irrelevant. She was irrelevant. And worse, laughable. The red of her face wasn't from embarrassment. It was from holding in the scream. The urge to snatch the report up and hurl it back at his chest. To say, actually, the last test rig you approved failed under load. And my model predicted that exact weld fracture radius before it even cracked. But she didn't. She bent slowly, picked up the report. Page edges warped, ink already smudging. She didn't wipe the dirt off. Didn't offer another word. Just stood back up, locked eyes with Rick for exactly 2 seconds, then turned and walked away. The silence wasn't passive. It was surgical. Her heart beat against her ribs like it wanted out of her. Behind her, more laughter. What, no comeback? Thought you desk types liked their little rebuttals. She imagined turning around and saying, You're not a foreman. You're a liability wrapped in Carhartt and arrogance. But again, silence. That would cut deeper. The walk back to the trailer office felt like a funeral march for the last shred of dignity she tried to hold on to in that yard. Her reflection in the window looked like someone she didn't quite recognize, mud-streaked, jaw clenched so tight she tasted metal. Inside, she shut the door and locked it. Then she laughed. A single, short, humorless burst. Because of course it happened like that. Of course she was still the joke in the room full of men who had mistaken their strength for intelligence and her silence for submission. Her hand hovered over the trash can. The report, thick with data, weighed heavy. Instead, she placed it flat on the desk, opened her laptop, and started a new file. Title: Revised Structural Prediction Model Version 2.1, Rick's Wake-Up Call. If they wanted war, they should have thrown something heavier than paper. If they thought she'd cry, they should have waited 5 more seconds. She was done trying to be polite. She barely slept. The inside of her eyelids kept flickering with phantom images of the report sinking into the mud. Page 37, stress fatigue chart, sliding off the back cover like it had given up on her too. She lay awake on the trailer's fold-out cot, staring at the ceiling tiles like they owed her answers. Every minute ticked by like a question. Do I fight or do I flee? She chose fight. By 6:40 a.m., she was in the office, coffee burned bitter in the pot, laptop glowing like a war drum. She'd rerun the model 3 times overnight, every scenario now tagged with failure imminent, in red boxes that even a caveman in a hard hat could read. She saved it all to a secure USB, clipped it under her badge lanyard, and wrote exactly 0 apology emails. At 7:12, tires crunched over gravel. She looked up through the blinds and froze. Black Escalade. No logos. High gloss. The kind of vehicle you don't buy, you're assigned. The passenger door opened and a man in a tailored coat stepped out, sunglasses and all, despite the cloud cover. Shit. Graham Lockwood, lead investor, chief capital vulture, and the only person who'd ever visited the site whose signature smelled like 6 figures. He was not scheduled. No emails. No heads up. No calendar block. No mercy. Rick didn't see him at first. The foreman was mid-yell, chewing out a guy for using a torque wrench wrong, still flexing like yesterday's humiliation didn't matter. Then the intern stammered. Sir? Someone important's here. Like really important. She didn't move from her desk. Just sipped her coffee. Rick lumbered into view, wiping his hands on his jeans like grease was a personality trait. Graham. Didn't know you were comin', man. His voice cracked with the kind of cheerfulness only desperation could fake. Lockwood barely blinked. Didn't want a parade. I wanted reality. His eyes scanned the pit, the frame, the mud. Then, sharp as a scalpel, he turned to Rick. You stress-tested this model already? Rick hesitated. A beat too long. We're running it through ya. Early stages, just prepping. Graham cut him off with a wave of his gloved hand. I was sent a report last week. Projected weld failure under torsion at 18.2 cycles. Your numbers say 60. Who did that analysis? Rick paled. His mouth opened, closed. His eyes slid, slowly, involuntarily, to the trailer window. To her. Inside, she blinked, heart hammering like it wanted to punch its way out through her ribs. She stood. Not fast, not triumphant, just steady. She opened the door and stepped out like it was just another Tuesday. Morning, she said, nodding to Lockwood. He gave her the smallest tilt of his chin in return. You ran the predictive model? I did. You stand by it? Yes, she said. And I'd be happy to walk you through the assumptions I made. Rick made a noise, half scoff, half panic. We're not doing some PowerPoint parade. We've got boots in the mud, not desks in the sky. Lockwood didn't even look at him. I'll decide whose boots matter. Silence fell. Thick. Unbreathable. Rick's authority melted faster than oil on steel in July. He tried to regain footing. We've got real-time field data coming in. Models are models, but... She didn't wait for permission. She pulled the USB from under her lanyard and held it up. This isn't a model. It's a forecast. And if you don't like storms, maybe don't ignore the clouds. Lockwood raised an eyebrow, then extended his hand. She placed the drive in his palm. Behind her, the other workers had stopped pretending not to watch. The same men who laughed yesterday were now whispering, eyes flicking between her and Rick like they'd just realized the cafeteria lady might have been packing a grenade all along. Rick stepped back, wordless, red-faced, losing altitude. Inside her, a flicker. Not joy, not even victory, just hope. The kind that stings when you're not sure it's safe to touch it. Her bitterness wasn't gone, but something new slid beneath it. A tension that didn't taste like despair. Maybe she wasn't a joke. Maybe the desk jockey just turned the entire site into her racetrack. Graham Lockwood stood at the center of the gravel yard like he owned not just the site, but gravity itself. The wind tugged at the hem of his coat as he turned to Rick, who was still trying to look relevant. Hands on hips, chin raised like posture could make up for evidence. The USB drive disappeared into Lockwood's inside pocket. His sunglasses were off now, revealing pale eyes that didn't blink much. So, he said casually, voice sharp enough to bleed through the morning chill. You told your team this analysis was, what was the word? Garbage, wasn't it? The crowd stiffened. Silence fanned out like wildfire. Rick gave a bark of a laugh, but it didn't carry. Just saying, we can't let some spreadsheet queen tell us where steel's gonna snap like she's psychic. We're men of the field out here, not TED Talk interns. He grinned weakly, but the smirk didn't land. Lockwood didn't grin back. Interesting. Because I ran her numbers through my own systems last night. Had 2 engineers verify them. We got a match. Within 0.4%. He paused, letting it hang. So I guess the question is, if her garbage is more accurate than your gut, why exactly are you still calling the shots? The reaction was instant, visible, physical. One of the welders exhaled with an audible damn. Another shifted, as if stepping slightly away from Rick might protect them from whatever came next. Rick's jaw twitched. With all due respect, sir, this is my site to run. Always has been. And yet, Lockwood said, turning slightly, gaze sliding to her. She's the only one who flagged the failure point before it happened. All eyes pivoted to her. She felt it, every muscle in her shoulders tightening, her spine pulled taut like a steel cable under tension. Her pulse fluttered. The bitter taste of yesterday's mud was still in her mouth, even though her boots were dry. She could feel the opening in the room. It wasn't an invitation, it was a pressure differential. A chance. If she spoke now, she'd be stepping out of the corner she'd been pushed into for months. No more hiding behind emailed reports and per my last message. No more ducking behind her degree and hoping for quiet respect. But if she spoke, and got it wrong, Rick would gut her reputation with a crowbar made of ridicule. And Lockwood? He'd walk away either way. Investors didn't save people. They placed bets. Still something flickered inside her. Not arrogance. Not courage. Something more dangerous. Clarity. She stepped forward, just once. Enough to break the invisible wall between observer and combatant. The wind licked her cheeks, stung her ears. Her voice, when she used it, was even and low. The stress point at Weld Junction B12 is being ignored because it doesn't fail on paper until cycle 53. But what's happening isn't paper. It's thermal creep from overnight tension. And your torque settings are off by 3%. I said 18 cycles because I accounted for that. That's not guesswork. That's field-informed math. Dead quiet. Even the crane stopped humming. Rick's mouth opened but nothing came out. Lockwood turned to him. You gonna argue with that, or just call it garbage again? Rick growled. This isn't how protocol works. She's not cleared for press briefings or public statements. Good thing this isn't a press briefing, Lockwood snapped. It's an intervention. Rick stepped back. His boots left deep impressions in the dirt, like the ground was trying to pull him down before he embarrassed himself further. His grip on authority was slipping, no longer absolute, now just loud. She could feel the shift. The kind of shift you don't ask for, but still comes like a tide pulling in. Some of the crew looked at her like they were seeing her for the first time. Not as a girl with graphs, but as someone who could read steel like scripture. Still, her fingers twitched with unease. Speaking had felt like slicing herself open in front of wolves. And she knew Rick wouldn't forget it. Not today. Not ever. But she didn't regret it. Let him plot. Let him glare. Because now he was the one who looked overexposed. And she was the one the investor just took seriously, publicly. She had chosen to risk retaliation over irrelevance. And now the stakes were no longer theoretical. They were personal. The site transformed into a stage, and Rick strutted like a man auditioning to keep his crown. Lockwood walked beside him, hands behind his back, face unreadable. She followed at a measured distance, clipboard in hand, pretending to take notes but really just watching, listening, calculating. Rick was in full performance mode now. Pointing at cranes, nodding toward cement curing pits, rattling off jargon that only sounded technical if you weren't paying attention. This rig's been running solid for weeks. Weld tolerances all within spec. We do a triple check on torque settings every shift. Real hands-on oversight. Lie. They passed the anchor plates where she'd noticed weld corrosion 3 days ago. She'd flagged it in an email. No reply. No repairs. Rick gestured toward it without a hint of acknowledgement. We monitor those weekly, nothing gets past our checks. Lie. Lockwood paused at the load platform, eyes scanning the tension lines. These pulleys are the original spec? Rick nodded too fast. Absolutely. Top grade, no sub-swaps. Another lie. She recognized the off-brand components. Cheaper, lower tensile rating, barely within threshold. They'd been swapped in after supply delays, and she had the receipts. Rick had insisted they were equivalent. Equivalent, if you didn't care about lifespan. Equivalent, if you were willing to risk a collapse for a discount. Behind them, 2 welders whispered to each other. One of them caught her eye and gave a small nod, not of greeting but of recognition. The unspoken message hit like a loaded glove. They know you were right. Every time Rick opened his mouth, she saw it. Cracks in the armor. His voice was just a little too loud, his explanations too rehearsed, his body angling slightly to block Lockwood's line of sight whenever they neared something questionable. But Lockwood noticed. She knew he did. Torque logs from the last 7 days? He asked casually mid-step. Rick stiffened. I can have 'em sent over. They're in the system. They weren't. She knew because she'd asked for them last week. Rick had said the foreman's word was better than numbers. She made a note on her clipboard anyway. Then came the pivot. Lockwood stopped near the lifting frame, the same frame Rick had called bulletproof. We'll be putting full load on this next week, correct? Rick hesitated. Yes, sir. All green lights. Lockwood turned his head slowly. And the stress test you threw in the mud yesterday warned against exactly that. Rick flinched. She stepped forward then, just half a pace, enough to claim the air between them. I can show you the model right now, she said, voice steady, cool, but laced with heat beneath the surface. If that frame sees a full load under current weld conditions, it has a 92% failure probability, and we don't have medevac coverage for that kind of accident. The yard fell still. Even the workers behind them stopped pretending to sweep, or measure, or tighten bolts. Every head tilted subtly toward the confrontation. Rick barked a laugh. You trying to scare him with Excel sheets? This isn't college anymore. No, she replied calmly. It's not. Which is why your duct tape shortcuts aren't just reckless, they're criminal negligence. That word, criminal, cut through the air like rebar through glass. Rick's face twisted. He opened his mouth, but Lockwood raised a hand, shutting him down with one subtle flick of the wrist. Then Lockwood turned to her. Take me to the spots you think will fail, he said. Not the ones in the tour. The tour ended right then. She led. And as she walked, past scaffolds with stress fractures painted over, past bolted plates that never saw a torque wrench, past electrical junctions with exposed wires tucked just out of sight, a strange, satisfying rage simmered in her gut. Not the helpless fury of yesterday. No. This was something cleaner. Sharper. The satisfaction of knowing. Knowing she wasn't crazy. Knowing they'd lied. Knowing the very ground Rick stood on was a monument to his shortcuts. And now? Now she was the mapmaker of every fault line. Behind her, the crew followed. Not openly, not dramatically, but with steps aligned just enough to signal something was shifting. Authority was slipping. Truth was leaking through like hydraulic fluid under pressure. And she was done cleaning it up. By late morning. The sky had cleared just enough to let a blade of sun slice through the sight, casting long shadows across rust-stained girders and tension steel. The yard still smelled like diesel and pretense, but something in the air had shifted. You could feel it, like ozone before a lightning strike. Graham Lockwood walked with the kind of measured slowness that made everyone around him anxious. Not hurried, not distracted, just watching, calculating. The clipboard in his hand was hers, passed over without ceremony. Her annotated diagrams were now his compass. They had veered off Rick's official walkthrough path 30 minutes ago. That path was all freshly swept gravel and straightened signage. Where they walked now was the underbelly, where the real work happened, where mistakes festered out of sight, where the mud dried over rust like makeup over bruises. At one support node, Lockwood paused. He gestured toward a bolted plate connecting two key beams. You said this was redone last quarter? Rick cleared his throat. Yes. Reinforced after the July load test. Lockwood stepped closer, knelt, and tapped the edge of the beam. Flakes of weld chipped off like peeling skin. His voice stayed cool. Then why are the markings on this bolt head from 2021? Rick blinked. That's just, must have reused an old fastener. Totally within code. Lockwood straightened, turned slightly then, without even looking at her, said, Your take. Her stomach dropped. Every eye snapped toward her. Rick's nostrils flared like a bull's. The welders who had once laughed behind her back now hovered on the edge of attention, pretending to check their tools but not missing a word. She kept her breath even, voice low and firm. It wasn't just the fastener reused. That plate hasn't been touched in 2 years. The reinforcement report was filed, but no work order was ever created. I flagged it in a maintenance audit request last month. It was ignored. Rick stepped in. You're gonna trust a spreadsheet over the guy who's walked this beam every day for 10 years? Lockwood finally looked at her, directly. Show me the audit. She pulled her phone from her hip holster, industrial strength, caked with dust and scratches, and opened the cloud log. 2 taps. There it was. Audit number 3092, Filed 3 weeks ago. Image attached. Plate marking identical. Work order, not found. Lockwood took the phone. His eyes flicked. Blinked. Nodded once. Then he handed it back to her, not Rick. Not the supposed authority. Her. That moment, the simple motion of one man's trust shifting, landed heavier than all the shouting Rick had ever done. It didn't roar. It whispered. But it cut. Rick opened his mouth, but Lockwood didn't wait. From now on, I want her copied on every maintenance log, torque report, and material requisition. No more information silos. Rick protested. With all due respect, she doesn't even have field clearance. Lockwood's tone sharpened. Then get her clearance. Or get replaced. Silence dropped like a curtain. She didn't smile. Didn't gloat. But the thrum in her chest was no longer shame or rage. It was weight. Her voice had weight now. She stood on the same dirt as yesterday, but it felt different under her boots. Solid. Anchored. Heard. Across the yard, one of the welders gave her a quiet thumbs up. The same guy who had turned away when Rick threw her report in the mud. The men who once laughed at her were now shifting uneasily, glancing between Rick and Lockwood, realizing the tide had turned, and the current was cold. She looked down at her own hands, still streaked with graphite from the report, still calloused from late nights in data rooms no one cared about. And for the first time since she'd walked onto this site, her silence wasn't a shield. It was a choice. They had cracked the wrong plate. And now the entire structure was about to shift up by noon. The site wasn't humming anymore. It was holding its breath. The air had turned heavy, the way it does before a storm breaks open. No birds, no idle chatter. Just the low, anxious clink of tools being moved around more for distraction than duty. Even the backhoe operator had shut off the engine and pretended to be checking hydraulics. What he was really checking was the drama unraveling 50 feet away. Rick had been quiet for nearly 15 minutes, too quiet. He'd watched Lockwood shadow her through the yard like a man forced to witness his own obsolescence. Every correction she made, every discrepancy she calmly exposed, every data point she produced without breaking a sweat. Each one chipped away at the empire of barked orders and half-truths he'd built his authority on. Now she stood with Lockwood at the torque bay. They were reviewing the inspection log she'd restructured months ago. The one Rick had mocked as overkill for bolts. He finally snapped. "This is bullshit." Rick barked, loud enough to startle a flock of pigeons off the roof of the trailer office. "She's been undermining me for weeks, sowing doubt, spreading reports to make me look bad. She's not auditing, she's gunning for my job." All heads turned. She didn't flinch. Just looked at him, expression unreadable. Arms still calmly folded over her clipboard. Lockwood turned slowly, like a man giving a wild animal one last chance to back down before pulling the trigger. "You think this is a coup?" Lockwood said, voice dangerously calm. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks less like sabotage and more like competence. Which is only threatening if your numbers don't add up." That line sucked the air out of the sight like a vacuum hose. Rick's face twisted, vein throbbing along his temple. "I've put years into this crew. I've trained half the guys here. Now she waltzes in with her graphs and formulas, and suddenly I'm the bad guy? You don't know what she's like when no one's looking." Lockwood's stare was ice. "I know she documented the failures you ignored, predicted the cracks you couldn't see, and proved your instincts are costing me money." He took a step forward. "The only thing I need to know now is whether you're salvageable, or just another over-promoted liability in a vest." You could have heard a wrench drop. Rick's jaw hung open for a moment, caught between rage and realization. That line, over-promoted liability, it landed like a branding iron. The men behind him suddenly seemed smaller, less sure of where to stand. The crew who once gathered behind him like disciples now scattered slightly, unsure if standing too close would make them collateral. She stayed still. Let it happen. Because this time, her silence wasn't defensive, it was lethal. And yet beneath the steel spine and the grim satisfaction that justice was finally being spoken aloud, she felt something colder stir. Dread. Not fear. Dread. Because she knew Rick. Not as a leader, but as a man who built his ego like a shoddy beam, thin-walled, overwelded, brittle. He wouldn't go down with dignity. He'd find a way to retaliate. Quietly. Vindicatively. Through whispers. Through accidents. She could already see the shift behind his eyes. Rage crystallizing into calculation. She'd won the moment. But the war? The war was about to get personal. And everyone on site could feel it. The balance had tipped. And with it, the illusion that this was just a job site. Now it was a battlefield. And she was standing right in the crosshairs. The air never quite settled after Rick's outburst. It just changed shape, like vapor cooling into fog, making everything feel dense and hard to navigate. The work resumed, technically, but nobody moved the same way. There were no more shouted orders, no more chest-puffing declarations about torque tolerances or structural confidence. Instead, there were glances. Quick ones sideways. Time to moments when Rick turned his back or slammed a door behind him. And there were murmurs, low enough to pretend they weren't happening, loud enough for her to know she was the subject. By 2 p.m., the admin trailer smelled like stale coffee and nervous energy. She was double-checking inspection logs, digitizing the hand-scrawled nonsense Rick had passed off as documentation. When one of the procurement girls slipped inside without knocking. Lisa. Quiet mid-40s, mouse-brown hair, and a voice that usually didn't rise above a whisper. She didn't say a word, just slid a folded sticky note across the edge of the desk while pretending to drop off a stack of invoices. When the door clicked shut behind her, the room went still. The note read, "We knew you were right. We just weren't allowed to say it." Below it, 3 initials, D.B. She stared at it for a long time, throat tightening. It wasn't joy. It wasn't even relief. It was recognition. A soft, almost apologetic confession from the silent majority. The ones who saw but said nothing, who nodded along to Rick's orders while quietly rerouting equipment behind his back to avoid the corners he'd cut. It was vindication, yes. But a lonely one. Because now they trusted her reports. Now they sent quiet notes and shared knowing looks. But before Graham Lockwood showed up, those same people had looked past her, talked over her, waved off her flagged inspections, chuckled when Rick mocked her as spreadsheet Barbie. They didn't believe in her. They believed in data that couldn't be ignored. And she wasn't sure which felt worse, being dismissed or being conditionally accepted. Outside, Rick had barricaded himself in the steel shack near the load bay, the one he called his command post. No one had seen him for hours. His radio was off. His voice, once a permanent fixture in the air, was silent. The site operated like a hive reorganizing after losing its queen. Systems rerouted. People adjusted. But the hum was different now, low, cautious, like everyone was waiting to see if the king bee would sting or simply die off quietly. She passed 2 welders inspecting a torque set near frame line C. One of them, an older guy with sun-split skin and nicotine-stained fingers, nodded to her. Not much. But it was something. Later, she caught someone, Diego from the electrical crew, quietly swapping out a mislabeled junction box she'd flagged in a report months ago. No announcement, no credit, just done. Like they were all slowly stitching the truth back together around her, piece by piece, without ever admitting it aloud. That evening in the admin trailer, she found her chair replaced. The old one, rickety, torn armrest, low back, was gone. In its place, a new one. Ergonomic. High back. Unspoken. She didn't ask who did it. Because she already knew. But even as she sat down and sank into the comfort of recognition, a chill threaded up her spine. Rick was quiet. Too quiet. And men like him didn't surrender. They stewed. They plotted. They waited. The crew might have started whispering her name like it meant something now. But Rick? He was waiting for his moment. And she'd learned the hard way. A wounded animal is always most dangerous when it's silent. They gathered at the center of the site just after shift change. Not officially, not formally, no emails, no memos. Just a slow gravitational pull toward the loading zone, where a folding table had been dragged out and Lockwood stood beside it like a judge preparing to read verdicts. Rick had been summoned. He hadn't come quietly. She heard him slam the door to the steel shack so hard it rattled the frame. His boots thudded across the gravel, fast and furious, like each step was trying to outrun the inevitable. Lockwood waited, arms crossed, expression unreadable. The wind had picked up again, tugging at blueprints and loose paper, Like the site itself wanted to get this over with. We're not leaving this yard until I get answers, Lockwood said. Voice calm but final. I've reviewed 2 sets of documentation. One submitted by your team, Rick, and one recovered by her. He didn't need to say her name. Everyone knew. Rick tried to cut in. My logs are the ones this site was built on. Her files are just retrofitted guesses, Monday morning quarterbacking. Lockwood didn't even blink. Funny then, how her guesses align perfectly with the stress points we're now seeing under load. How her timestamps match real-time shift logs. How your reports contain entire days with no entries, and torque logs that conveniently match spec to the decimal across 5 different days. He tossed a printed sheet onto the table. Statistically impossible. Rick flushed deep red. You think I've got time to babysit every damn number, while trying to keep these yahoos from killing themselves? I delegate. Lockwood nodded slowly. Then it seems you've delegated yourself into irrelevance. The silence that followed was thick, charged. Workers stood just out of the spotlight but within earshot, pretending to adjust gloves, to sweep gravel, to tighten bolts that didn't need tightening. And yet none of them left. Rick stepped forward, voice lowering into that growling, patronizing tone he'd used so often. She's been gunning for this for months. This isn't about safety, it's about making me look bad. But his voice lacked conviction now. It trembled at the edge. She stepped forward only when Lockwood gave her a subtle nod. No fanfare. Just the same flash drive from before, now slid calmly across the table. I have time-stamped entries, change logs and backup copies of everything, she said, including 3 flagged safety concerns that never made it into the final reports. Rick scoffed. She's lying. Those files could be doctored. Lockwood replied before she could. We had them independently verified yesterday. They're clean. Rick froze. A few workers glanced at each other, subtle, sharp movements. One exhaled slowly through his teeth. Another shook his head. It was the look of people watching a slow-motion car crash. Tragic, inevitable, impossible to stop. He was unraveling in front of them. Rick looked around, seeking purchase, eye contact, support, something. But the crew who once nodded along to every barked order were suddenly very invested in their boots. Their gloves. The horizon. No one moved to stand beside him. Not one. And that, more than anything, was the final blow. His voice dropped to a growl. You're all gonna regret this. Lockwood gave a tight smile. Maybe. But you'll regret it first. That line landed like a coffin lid snapping shut. Rick's shoulders sagged. His bravado drained out like hydraulic fluid from a burst seal. He turned without another word and walked off. Past the crowd, past the trailers, past the frame that once represented his power. No one followed. The gravel crunched like dry bones under his boots. By the time the office door slammed shut again, he was a ghost. And just like that, it was over. She stood there, motionless, clipboard in hand, watching it all unfold. No celebration. No applause. Just the quiet hum of murmurs filling the void he left behind. Knew it. She was right the whole time. Guy buried himself. Vindication wrapped around her like a winter coat. Too heavy, too late. She hadn't destroyed him. She hadn't needed to. He had done it all himself. All she did was tell the truth louder than his lies could stretch. She looked down at the flash drive. Still warm from her grip. Still holding every ignored warning like a time capsule of stubborn pride. And yet something inside her felt hollow. She didn't feel like the victor. Just the last one standing after a landslide. Because when the truth finally wins, it rarely feels like triumph. It feels like a body count. The site was quieter the next morning, not in volume, but in presence. The kind of quiet that follows a reckoning. No one mentioned Rick by name. His locker was already cleaned out. His desk emptied. The chair at the foreman's station, once treated like a throne, now sat slightly askew, wires dangling from a hastily yanked monitor. A ghost's imprint, still warm. Word had traveled fast. Officially, he resigned for personal reasons. Unofficially, everyone knew. The man who had ruled by volume and intimidation had been brought down by numbers and silence. She sat in the admin trailer, the USB still on her desk like a relic of war. Lockwood stood near the coffee machine, pouring 2 cups, as if they were simply colleagues reviewing Q4 projections. But there was something colder in his eyes now. Respect, yes, but laced with calculation. As if her competence had moved her from pawn to piece, but not quite to player. He handed her the mug. Black, no sugar. No pretense. I'll be recommending you for interim operations lead, he said. With a pay bump. You've earned it. She blinked once. Thank you. Careful, he added, sipping his own coffee. Competence makes enemies. That landed heavier than praise. She nodded, because he was right. Every step she'd taken to prove her worth had been a knife into someone else's ego. Rick wouldn't be the last to resent her. And the others, the ones who'd watched, waited, and only spoke once the tide turned, would smile now but keep their distance. Gratitude was temporary. Threats were permanent. She walked the yard alone later, scanning frames, welds, torque specs. People nodded to her now. Not dismissive nods, measured ones. Careful. Like she was a storm cloud that could also bring rain or lightning, depending on the day. And she felt it in her chest. The burn of victory. Yes, but laced with something sour. Because to survive, she'd had to stay silent when the lies first started. She'd had to let Rick dig his own grave, knowing she could have intervened earlier, stopped the descent before it became catastrophic. But she hadn't. Because exposing rot doesn't mean you get to stay clean. And when the moment came, she hadn't just defended herself, she'd cut. Clean. Public. Irreversible. There had been a cost, and she hadn't hesitated to make someone else pay it. She returned to her desk around sunset. The yard lights flickered on. The same corner office she was once thrown out of was now hers. The same floor she'd scraped mud off after Rick's tantrum was freshly mopped. She sat. Alone. The chair was comfortable. Ergonomic. Quiet. And yet she didn't feel at peace. She felt intact. Not whole. Just intact. She opened a fresh document. Typed the first line of her new report. Then paused. Looked out the window, where the last crane creaked against the orange sky. Her reflection barely looked different. Same face, same calm. But inside? Inside she was steel now. Cold-forged. Quiet. Permanent. She whispered to herself, dryly, without emotion, just fact. Turns out the garbage wasn't in my report, it was running the site. No esmail. No aplausos. Just the sharp sting of truth, tasted alone. Victory salted with isolation. Bridges burned. Dignity intact. Future uncertain. But for the first time in a long time, undeniably hers.